Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back from lunch. If you're still lingering, feel free to join us because it should be an excellent session that we have coming up on Ukraine in the global economy, how to generate breakthrough growth. Most importantly, we hope to be joined by the Finance Minister, Mr. Danyliuk, by Skype at some point in the proceedings shortly. I trust in the wonders of Skype, but I never quite believe it until it's on a screen right in front of me. So organisers, when that line is coming up, can someone just give me a signal so that we can greet Mr. Danyliuk? But I think that we should press on with our existing panel in the meantime. Panel, you might also like to think about what you would like to ask Mr. Danyliuk if and when, by the wonders of technology, he appears. So let me introduce my panel. Next to me is Neil Lancastle of de Montfort University, Leicester, in the UK. He's formerly of the iShares team at Barclays Global Investment and also formerly Record Treasury Management FX hedge fund. Welcome to you, Neil. Next to Neil, we have Makar Paseniuk, managing partner at ICU, known to most of you in the room. Welcome, so to speak, to your own panel, Makar. Great to see you. Next to Makar is Gösta Ljungman, a resident representative of the IMF in Ukraine. And next to him, at the far end, Timothy Ash, senior EM sovereign strategist, BlueBay Asset Management. My heavy-hitting team, welcome to you all. So I thought what we'd do with our time is let you do your short introductions, a few minutes. I've got a bit strict on time as the day has gone on. I have to leave you, I'm afraid, at 4 for a flight, so there is that too. And then we will, of course, break if Mr. Danyliuk comes on the line. Neil, why don't you kick us off? You had a lot of very hefty kind of formalies in your title, so you know a lot of territories that impact on this question. Just give us your introductory thoughts about UK and the global economy and what next.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Hold your mic up a little bit. Boom your thoughts out to the whole of Odessa.
I'm going to make a couple of assumptions before I start. I heard the speeches this morning. I'm going to assume that some kind of financial liberalisation is going to take place. And unlike Varoufakis, much as I agree with him that we should reform Bretton Woods, I'm going to assume that actually the macro environment's going to stay pretty much the same, which means the US is going to be generating deficits, there's going to be a surplus of dollars, and it's looking for new people to absorb those surpluses. So it's looking for new ways to kind of keep the show on the road. So I'm going to talk about two key problems that creates for Ukraine. The first one is cost of capital. It's too high. Yes, I mean, I know that there was a recent launch. It was a dollar, a recent debt issue. It's dollar-based. It's over 7%. I know there's been a difficult background, but 7% means you can't do important projects. Yeah, there's important investments you can't fund. And secondly, I'm going to suggest that you look at equity much more strongly than you have, because equity is your buffer if things go wrong. Your equity holders are not going to demand a dividend. Yeah, they're not going to demand, they're going to sell. There's going to be an asset price crash, but it gives you at least a buffer in terms of your cash flows. So when it comes to the first problem around cost of capital, what I've heard today from talking to people is that your biggest problem there is with high cost of capital, you run out of foreign exchange. So you attract investment, you go for liberalisation, things go fine for a few years, yeah, the currency appreciates, then things go wrong, you don't have any FX. So I had some quite reassuring discussions this morning with people from the central bank that when you do liberalise, you're going to have settlement in local currency. So this is a really good news story, yes? This is what Brazil did. Yeah, that means your banking system isn't going to run out of foreign exchange when you have a liquidity crisis, because it will come. So I think there are some good stories there. But as a heterodox economist, the heterodox tend to talk about this The problems with liberalisation, the problem will come when there's a crisis. So you need to be sure that your FX loans are sufficiently collateralised. I think we're going to talk about collateralisation soon. So I would say be very, very careful when you liberalise the balance sheet about FX risk. Don't have time to talk about it now. But
I'm going to hold you there for a very good reason, that we're joined now, I think, by the Minister of Finance. He's going to give us a short presentation of his thoughts of where we are, and then I hope that we can keep him on the line and take some questions from the panel for him. And Mr. Danyliuk, do we have you by the wonders of Skype?
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Hi.
Well, unfortunately, I cannot see you. Well, looks like I cannot hear you either. Hopefully, I'm not being pranked by Vavan and Lexus. But in any way, whatever I say is true and positive. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the conference. I was planning to be earlier today in Odessa to see my friends, to see to speak with thought partners in not only in Ukraine but also internationally. But good that we have technologies now in the 21st century that allows us to communicate remotely. I had to stay here today is a special day to pass pension reform today, but it looks like we've been delayed by the judiciary reform, which we went only through the half of the, or even less than half of the amendments. So that's slightly, it keeps us needs to be in shape, but it looks like it might not happen today. But we'll still push for its adoption in the nearest future. In terms of, also tomorrow we will present the budget. We submitted this on time, and it's a good budget that supports the Ukraine story of of recovering economy, recovering, growing economy, which is more important. Also, we have, I'm sure you've heard about the good news that we earlier this week we placed 3 billion euro bond issue. That involved a lot of work on Minister of Finance side. We've been traveling for almost 2 weeks. Also was quite exhaustive, but I believe the result that we achieved, we should be all proud of. And this is a justification. This is also the proof that the reform agenda that we've been implementing for the last 3 years under the leadership of the president, governments, they brought some serious results, which are now accepted by the investors, and so that they actually supported these important transactions with their money. This is not just to give you some information on these transactions. Is that the more than half of the money is tendered for the bonds that would mature in 2019, 2020. That is very important part of transaction. It allows us to smooth out the payments profile and reduce our risks, overall risks that are taken into account by the investors, but also by the rating agencies. So that transaction should reduce our overall risk and should create the conditions for further improvement of the ratings. That would in turn allow us to, when we come to the market next time, to raise it in a more beneficial, raise the money at more beneficial terms, cheaper, but it's not only for the state, but also for the private sector. They could, when they tap the market, they will be able to raise their money cheaper and invest it in the development. In terms of the profile, of investors' profile, we had more than 350 investors participated. This is extremely important. So we have a diversified investor base, and majority of the investors are long-term investors. They believe in Ukraine. They believe in our story. What we have achieved over the last 3 years is a justification and the proof that whatever we plan going forward, we will successfully achieve.
Mr. Danyliuk, can you hear us here?
Overall,
No?
demand was in excess of 10 billion. That also shows that, yes, it's a good environment now in the market, but if we don't have good story, if we're not credible, we won't be able to be successful. So, I pretty much, I would like to use this opportunity to thank everyone who took very active role in this transaction. First of all, I would like to thank my team. I would like to thank the advisors and the syndicate that help us to design this, I would say, state-of-the-art transaction and lead it to successful completion. Now, more closer to the topic of the panel, Ukraine's positioning in the global economy. I would start that it is very important to discuss it, to keep it in focus. Ukraine historically was inward-looking, and that didn't help us. I think we need to be more global. We need to be less local. I took part in New York in the conference, Concordia conference, when actually the preservation of the current liberal world order was discussed. It's seriously discussed now whether we will be able to preserve it, and whether we will be able to find the answers to the challenges that at the moment stay in the way. So actually, in this situation, Ukraine cannot just be focused on our own problems. Right? We need to see the global picture. We need to see how the global competition is developing. And we need to understand also the huge risk of the populism worldwide. And look at our populists as people who actually go against the country. And be very responsible about our own position, about own reform agenda, defending it and promoting it proactively and aggressively. Because, yes, we've been successful over the last 3 years. Yes, economy returned to growth. Yes, we returned to the markets. But we cannot be satisfied with that. It's it's not even not even at midpoint of our journey. This is just a beginning, and we need to continue with reforms. I know that reforms in Ukraine, I cannot say it's become like a swearing word, but because it's being used and misused many often. We have some, I think, overusing it. But at least the audience that I'm addressing now, you understand, I hope and believe you understand the importance of real reforms. And that's what's going to change Ukraine. We already started a lot of the reforms, but they need to be implemented. They need to be implemented in order for Ukrainians to feel the results, to see the results, tangible results. It's not the case yet, and that makes our work more complicated because, we people who really understand in what's being done now, we believe and we see how it will change years. And it's very important to address this gap when, yes, people receive some negative side of the reform, they not yet receive the positive, cannot enjoy the positive side of it. This for next 2 years, it will be crucial.
Mr.
And we need to
Danyliuk,
fill this
can I
gap
ask you if you
with
can hear us?
with the right communication,
Apparently not.
but also with more and more reforms that target the development of our economy, but also address the social needs of our citizens. So, in terms of the focus for the future, I would specify, I would highlight several. First of all, is the tax administration reform. I believe it's one of the most important reforms that unlocks improves the business climate, but also returns the trust of people to the state. This service was historically corrupt, and we need to turn it into being very professional, lean, and service-oriented. That should be the new face of the Ukrainian government institution. Land reform. I believe we need to do it this year, to do everything possible to adopt this reform this year. Ukraine enjoys leading position in agriculture, in some key sectors of agriculture globally. And this is without having normal market in Ukraine. That seems to be a very strange situation that needs to be addressed. So when we implement the land market, normal land market with free circulation of land, agricultural land, we will boost the development of agricultural sector and economy overall. Privatization, and next 2 years should be the 2 years when we complete the privatization in large. We made some mistakes in the past. We learned from these mistakes. So we're changing now the process for privatization, preparing companies for privatization and running the privatization process itself. So it should be now the preparation for privatization should take twice as less time. I mean, it may be even 3-4 times less as time as now. And we should also build a very attractive, substantial pipeline of the companies and offer all of them at the same time. We cannot spend time on building the capacities of state property fund to sell such companies. We just don't have time for that. And the track record shows that all attempts in the past were failed. So we would rather
that seemed a rather abrupt
how to do it.
Farewell. No, here we go.
Yes. And the rest would be sold through the electronic auctions. And last but not least is the legal enforcement, law enforcement agencies reform. Yeah, we can address many economic elements, but the law enforcement is at the core, right? We still have unreformed law enforcement infrastructure that needs to be changed. And I'm promoting the idea of creating the Financial Investigation Unit, a specialized, lean, highly professional institution that effectively would investigate the economic crimes against the state and will not harass business, as unfortunately being done now by the existing agencies. So that's what I see are the critical kind of path for moving Ukraine forward. And obviously, just to finalize, is on this path there should be no reversal of the previous successes. And we should also engage business to the maximum extent, because what I feel now in some of the examples that business believes that they should be passive and the government, it's a role of the government.
Просимо пробачення, чуєте ви нас?
Hello,
Yeah,
Mr. Danyliuk. Are you hearing us?
Yes, I am.
Oh, fantastic. Welcome.
Now,
I am your
only
silent
now
presenter.
I can hear you.
I have
Good.
we enjoyed that very much. Unfortunately, you couldn't hear us. What I thought might be a good idea, if you were able to stay with us a few minutes, is I have such a skilled panel in front of me. I thought perhaps one of them or a few of them could ask you some questions. Is that okay?
I will be happy. I will be happy to stay, especially now I can hear you, because I already started to feel like I'm telling it to myself. So now I'm much more happy
you were
to
telling
stay,
it to us.
and will be happy to answer the questions.
No, you were definitely telling it to us, but we had a feeling like, it was a bit like talking to a spirit from another world. But we're very much connected now. I was moving along our panel, and I was about to go to Makar Paseniuk from ICU. And actually, Makar, why don't you just take over for a moment and ask a question of the finance minister?
Oleksandr, good afternoon. It's good to have you here. Well, since we're here sitting on a panel that should be talking about growth, in your opinion, what are the main factors that move the needle on growth for Ukraine? And what is the time frame that we're talking about to implement whatever needs to be implemented and start seeing the results?
The time frame, look, we don't have much time for preparation. We've been preparing for so many years, right? I believe I cannot say we need to start now, because we've done a lot already. But, the reforms that I mentioned, privatization, the land market reform, tax administration reform, law enforcement, they need to be, the efforts need to be doubled now. So, and by the way, the implementation of such reforms will not take long, right? They all could be achieved within less than 1 year. If done properly, if this is a priority, that all could be achieved within 1 year. And yes, I believe that the impact will come pretty soon. I have a feeling after I met with more than 100 investors, but overall they've been managing, they manage more than $2 trillion, right? I had a feeling, very strong feeling, that tsunami is coming, but tsunami in a good sense, not devastating tsunami, but positive tsunami. Interest of Ukraine, interest of investing into the country. We just need to use this momentum and continue showing the progress of reforms, and then it will be the geometrical progression. So we will see that it will trigger more and more investors to come. For example, if we look at privatization, if we are successful next year with privatizing, let's say, 20 large companies, the companies that will take, the buyers that will take part in this privatization, they will create the necessary information environment. They'll speak between themselves. They will trigger more and more interest to Ukraine, which we need to pick up with more companies to be offered for privatization, for example, or new opportunities to be offered in some areas where we, create opportunities for investments. Energy, healthcare at the end of the day, right? So that's how I see it. I see how to bring growth to the country. And I believe we can talk about 6-7%, within the next 2 years.
Can I interrupt you there, Mr. Danyliuk? Because that's a very optimistic figure. We hear the 7%, or 6 to 7% bandied around a lot. Can I just bring in someone else from the panel? Timothy Ash, a senior EM sovereign strategist at BlueBay Asset Management. Does that sound credible to you, Timothy? You need your microphone and quite close. Just so Mr. Danyliuk hears you.
Is this on? Oh, yes. Not really. I mean, I guess the concern is, from a very low base, as was mentioned this morning, whatever a 20% real GDP decline in the period since 2014, you've just generated 2.4% growth this year. So I think the assumption would have been it would have been a lot stronger. I guess with Alex on the line, it's a good opportunity to ask a question, which would be, you know, the big concern out there is you've been very successful with the Eurobond deal, right? Great deal, 3 billion, technically, you know, useful in terms of you've addressed the short maturity structure of the debt problem, you've extended maturity. You know, we'd all appreciate for that. You've got some cash in the bank. But in the past experience of Ukraine and relationships with the market and relationships with the IMF is as soon as you get access to markets, your enthusiasm for doing IMF deals and meeting IMF conditionality lapses. So what assurance can you give guys like me that did participate in the deal that because there's easy financing available globally, that you'll be less interested in the kind of structural reforms that I think are so important to improving the business environment? And we all know what the kind of reforms are, right? You know, pension, healthcare, land reform, business environments, anti-corruption. I mean, the concern at the moment, and it's been very well articulated in the media in the last few days, has been that now you've got money in the bank, that basically the political will to carry out some of these reforms will weaken. And increasingly, there's going to be a focus on the 2019 elections, and there's going to be a much more populist pro-growth agenda. How about that? How about that, Alex?
I appreciate your question. You know, with all respect to you, can I ask you a question? Why did you participate?
You're on the spot, Tim.
No, we participate because we're very big. You know, we manage $25 billion of money. We're index players. In a way, we often cannot not participate because we're measured against the index. And I think, you know, one of the factors was that we're in an environment where there's no yield. And essentially, emerging markets offer some yield. Ukraine's a relatively high-yielding play. So there's a global backdrop that is very positive for Ukraine. At the same time, you know, as you know, I appreciate the fact that Ukraine has come a very long way in 3 years. And, you know, you have delivered energy reform, bank reform.
That's it.
All those kind of things.
Tim. That's it.
I'd like to bring in someone else. So Mr. Danyliuk, do you want a quick word back on that?
Sure.
But actually, can I just say one thing? Alex, the question is, am I going to go overweight Ukraine, right? I may be market weight Ukraine at the moment because I'm not sure. We were overweight. Question is, am I confident enough in you to put more money to work in Ukraine? And I'm not sure at the moment, to be honest. I'm waiting to see if you deliver on the IMF agenda. If you don't...
And that's, you just answered the question, right? You know, first of all, you know, I remember our discussions during the roadshow and, you know, and before that. You know, what I believe, there is some slight, there is no that much link between the tapping the markets and driving the reforms forward. I just don't see that much link because, you know, I would argue that if just imagine that Ukraine decides all of a sudden, next day, stop with the reform agenda. Do you still think that we will enjoy the access to the market? Do you still think that, you know, we will be able to communicate with investors, asking them to buy our bonds when we actually failed on our promises? I don't think so.
Well,
and this is overall questions, is how to move with the reform agenda. Forget about the market access. How to move forward, giving some other challenges. Given the challenges that, you know, the role of IFIs are not that critical in terms of, you know, in terms of pressure for them. We need to be able to have our, you know, rely on all our own forces, right? All capacity in order to promote a reform agenda. That's where the real challenges are, and I believe that we will be successful there. But don't confuse it with access to the market.
Fine. Let's bring in Gösta Ljungman from the IMF, seeing as that the IMF was, you know, an underlying theme there as well, and what can reasonably be expected. What was your response there to what Mr. Danyliuk had to say about the outlook? Hold it a bit closer.
Does this work? Okay.
Yeah, very nicely.
So I think that the thing that has struck me since arriving in Ukraine and since starting to work again on Ukraine this time is how much has been achieved over the past 3 years, which is, I mean, it's in sort of Ukraine historical context, it's amazing. And I'm sort of encouraged by that, and I recognize, I mean, the argument that Tim makes that historically also for Ukraine, once things are looking a little bit better, growth picks up, there's access to markets, then the appetite to pursue reform that slows down, which in the past has led to this boom and bust cycle and sort of very low average growth levels. But I think the past 3 years have indicates that reform is possible, and now this sort of Ukraine is no longer in a crisis management mode. The economy has been stabilized, and growth is returning, albeit at low levels. And there are difficult reforms. These things that have been mentioned, the comprehensive pension reform, a land reform that's long overdue.
But you see, that might be my challenge, Mr. Danyliuk. What would you speed up? Where would you put your priorities? We've had a lot of different views today at the forum. Strong plea for land reform this morning from one of the guests on the panel. Some worries that the corruption court is kind of stalled. It's going to happen one day, but it's not. It's always coming. It's never there. What are you going to press faster on that you haven't achieved to date? I mean, what could people expect your own priority list to look like?
Yeah. Well, good question, and good to you, because this is what I wanted also to highlight is that. And that's what the team is always referring to our, in our past, right? And look, you failed before means we will fail in the future. This is the story. We have a new Ukraine now, right? So looking in the past does not help. Walking quickly forward while constantly looking back could cause some injuries, right? This is not what we. That's not what we. That's not our type of walk, right? So
I'm still missing what the priority is, though.
I believe. Okay, now I already highlighted the priorities, and it's these priorities. I didn't come up with the list out of the blue. I see where reforms progressed, right? I see where the areas were not reformed, and that. They prevents our growth. Again, law enforcement and judiciary. Law enforcement and judiciary. This is number one, right? When we still have SBU, general prosecutor, tax police and economic police running, harassing businesses, even if we improve business climate in energy or, in any other sectors, but these agencies can kill everything. So we need to create financial investigation unit. This is number one priority. Land reform, I don't even want to discuss it. I've been a long-time promoter of land market reform. It's also important, right? Privatization. And tax administration. This is the priorities that I highlighted. And I strongly believe that they will much faster growth than we have at the moment.
Right, Neil Lancastle sitting next to me here, listening to all of that. So, where was your optimism, pessimism indicator? What would you like to ask the finance minister?
I wanted to come back to the cost of capital. So it's very expensive at the minute to raise capital in Ukraine. If you can bring through some of these reforms before you privatise, so corporate social responsibility, stronger rules around listing, accountability, transparency, your cost of capital will be much lower. Your growth will be slower, but it will be more sustainable. So it's really kind of that same question, which matters most, privatisation or reform?
Minister, clear question.
Goodness, right? Why should we choose? First of all, different people do it, right? Privatization is important, and it's not about the money that we're going to bring to the budget. We want to see these companies to be privately owned so that it will be more effectively managed.
Neil,
so that it would
does that make
not
sense?
disturb
Why
the
choose?
competition in their sector. So privatization, I know I will not trade for anything else, right? I actually support, a lean, effective government with least participation in the economy. We need to be very effective in the policy making. I'm a libertarian, and this is what I believe in. And but reforms are reforms. We cannot stop there, right? I would never make a choice between the two.
Can I give an example? So in the emerging market local currency bond fund, as an example, some of your neighbours can borrow at 3-4%. Czechoslovakia has a negative yield on some of its dollar-denominated debt. That, to me, is a sign of reform and good governance. That's more sustainable growth because you're not paying these creditors such high penalty rates. So you have to have some reform to make the growth sustainable. Do you agree with that?
Well, I do agree with that. And can I rephrase that? We need to continue reforms. We shouldn't do it. We need to continue doing this. And our rates, yes, we're still at quite high level, but we managed to compress quite significantly yields only because of reforms. And what we've borrowed recently is it's a minimum amount that we actually need for and it's budgeted, and it's an IMF program. We do not go beyond that. Obviously, the plan is to reduce the cost of capital going forward, for sure. And also, just another point is not only about the borrowing in dollars. Hopefully we will, by the end of the year, will remove all the obstacles, the opportunities for the foreign investors to invest in our local denominated debt. So we expanding the instruments that could be used by investors, and we're working on the reform agenda, and we reduce cost of capital. And by the way, another point, and we reduce the budget deficit, thus reducing the need for such financing. So we're not under pressure.
Makar, you wanted to come in.
I just want to jump in because effectively we spent...
Stay on your mic, please.
We spent the entire session talking about debt. In my opinion, markets do justice, and reforms or not reforms, the markets are driven by greed and fear. And in this particular case, Ukraine has achieved, has tapped the markets again, all very good. The other alternative is IMF. But in reality, with debt to GDP where it is now, we shouldn't be talking about the price of the next billion that we can borrow, because very quickly it will, the debt to GDP, if we continue in the past, IMF stops, of borrowing and not doing anything. IMF will stop lending because we would be in breach of key, debt ceiling ratios and so on and so forth. We would be in breach of, the restructuring commitments that Ukraine assumed when it restructures the debt. So the show will be will be over very quickly. What we should be talking about is deleveraging, and in a sense, if you want, how to raise equity for the country. And and in my opinion, and I argued about it last year, I will continue arguing it, that we can rely on the private sector and fundamental kind of stable macro growth, but as was discussed in the previous panels, it's not going to get us anywhere. What we need is ways to stimulate growth that will allow us to get a better credit rating. The better credit rating, if the interest rates stay where they are, will achieve will let us lower the cost of debt and so on and so forth. So what, in my opinion, we should be talking about is how do you raise equity, and what can investors invest into, and in this particular case, we're talking about the FDIs. And my argument is that without the government interference, i.e., structural reforms, unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't have much to offer, at least on the private sector side. And,
Just bring it to a question if you can.
Well, it's not a question, it's a comment. I don't have any questions. It's a comment.
Well, can I briefly react to this? I totally support Makar, totally, right, and it's very important how to bring equity, and the answer is privatization. What we've learned is that bringing equity in other sectors without progressing with privatization does not work, because investors look and say, listen, you want us to bring money into private sectors, and yet you don't want to reduce your participation in on the market. It doesn't go together. So privatization is important because it improves competition, it brings investors in, it acts as a trigger for some other investments. And I give you examples, for example, how health change the financing of the healthcare system. Private hospitals should have equal access, right, to the money that state pays as a part of guaranteed package to finance the treatment of the citizens. So we create competition, and yes, it's an excellent opportunity for investors to step in. In energy sector, similar thing. The situation when we improve the regulation, we create the opportunities for the private money to expand their presence in this sector. So I just wanted to start with privatization, but have much larger things in mind. And all structural reforms that we do open opportunities for investments. That's how we see it.
Let me just take a bit, some responses or perhaps advance. How long can you stay with us, Mr. Danyliuk, just out of interest?
Can I have another 5 minutes because I have
yeah,
to,
sure.
I have to
In
go.
that case, I understand it. I think you have a day job as well as talking at the forum, so we're very pleased that you join us. But I would
there is some, yes.
Yeah, you have the odd thing to do this afternoon, I gather. Right, Timothy at the far end of the panel. Any thoughts arising from that, particularly I think we've got the minister for, probably on his last round of comments. So I'd like to take you each in turn, with your thoughts that you'd like to feed in. If we could start, Timothy's got the mic, he's off.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I need to reiterate, Alex is a good guy. He's the good guy, one of the good guys. His ideas are totally on the right page. We agree on everything. We need to support guys like Alex, and I think, he needs more support within his own cabinet and within the administration for the kind of ideas he has. Because
are you suggesting that the cabinet is not supporting the Minister of Finance in part?
Well, I think Alex has had various battles over the months, and I'm sure it's quite challenging for him. And
he's got a marvelous smile on the screen behind us.
Part of the job.
He's got plenty of scars, and he's got plenty of experience in the administration. I'm sure he can deal with the various parties in cabinet. But I think just going back, I think we're at a key junction. There's some really important reforms that have been well articulated previously that need delivery. The quicker, actually the earlier session we had today was about speed. And that's really important. It's about the right messaging to foreign investors. It's about sending the right external message. And actually, Bokros, what a wonderful guy. He was one of my heroes as an economist, transition economist. 96 to 98, the reforms he undertook in Hungary. Privatization, bringing foreign direct investors in. You need to be hiring people like Bokros to give advice about why they were successful. And, I speak at a lot of panels in Ukraine, too many probably. But, in the end, it all comes down to the same thing, right? Ukraine needs foreign direct investments, like Hungary did, like Serbia is getting now. And you're in an environment where you're competing for foreign direct investors. They have choices where they locate, right? They can go to Serbia, Hungary, Poland. Why would they come to Ukraine, right? Okay, big domestic market, competitive exchange rate, skilled labor, competitively priced labor, but a really bad business environment, or historically it has been. So the focus needs to be improving the business environment, that when any foreign direct investor have any interface with Ukraine, it's a positive experience, and build on success. And unfortunately, I think if you look at the surveys, the number one thing that comes up is corruption, bureaucracy, corruption, all those kind of things. And I think it's really at top of the pile. And I think you need to send a really positive message to to the outside world that you're addressing it. And unfortunately, no bandits have gone to jail in this country. The only person who's ever gone to jail was Tymoshenko, who was jailed for something she really probably didn't do, right? But it's remarkable. Behaviour has to change.
Is that a fair point that keeps coming up? Or should you be actually expediting, putting some bad guys, if they're guys, behind bars to kind of show seriousness about corruption?
Well, definitely. I think that's how it should be judged, right? Because we have plenty of cases, investigation cases of being completed already, and now the case is stuck in courts. Obviously, if there will be no imprisonment, right, then it means that the whole system does not work properly, and people will lose trust in the system. And thank you, team, for good words. In terms of, it will be great to get Vokrash here in Ukraine. But so far, we've got a person who he educated, Yuri Butsa, my deputy. He was a student of Vokrash. And he's with me for many years already. So we're getting some.
We're going to let you go in just a minute. I think we got the thought. I felt I should let in Gösta Ljungman again as the representative of IMF in Ukraine, because he's been patiently waiting. Is there any closing thought or challenge that you might have for the Minister of Finance before he leaves us?
I'd like to continue looking at this from the positive side. So I mentioned before that reform is possible, and that's been shown over the past 3 years. I think I'm very encouraged to hear what Minister Danyliuk says. His reform priorities of ensuring fiscal sustainability, land reform, anti-corruption reform, reducing the footprint of the government in the economy, improving tax administration, we share those priorities, and I think half of the job is done by having identified and having reached consensus of what needs to be done. I think the challenge now is actually to implement these reforms, and here we're counting on Minister Danyliuk and his colleagues to do this.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Danyliuk. It was lovely to have you with us. You couldn't see us, but you were responding very well in real time. I think it was very much appreciated by the audience that you made time. Next year, we might see you in person. Can you give a big round of applause? Thank you very much.
I'll do my best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Have a good day.
So, panel, we've got just a quick half hour to perhaps jump off that and into some broader themes. I think I'll bring it back to Neil, who got us going there just before the great spirit of Mr. Danyliuk appeared on the screen. So we had a lot of challenges there. He sounded quite bullish, I thought, or quite robust about what he'd be able to do. Do you share that feeling?
Well, I've still got the scars from when the UK went through this. We had a mythical investor called Sid. So when we had privatizations, the public you had to have the confidence of the public for that privatization that it wouldn't go wrong. Now, I heard at lunch that 7 of the 11 IPOs up to 2011 in Poland had failed. So you have to have sufficient confidence from the public. You have to take the public with you. So I'd be interested to hear from the room, actually, if you feel, from what I've heard, the public aren't confident about privatisation.
That's a very good question. Why don't we throw it out to the floor? Who's got a strong view, pro or con, privatisation or anything arising from it? Anyone like to come back on Neil's point? Someone must have a view on privatisation. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
I have a comment, probably a bit controversial. Privatization is great and should take place, and in my opinion, should be done at whatever price it's possible, just to bring, better governance, more efficiency, and private capital, and to be kind of, the example for, others that are still sitting or waiting on the sidelines that things can be done in Ukraine. But having said that, in my opinion, if you look at what the state owns, we're not talking about much money. And some of the key privatizations in the energy sector are unfortunately, they're meaningless without structural reforms in the energy sector that a lot of the donors are working on. Because effectively what the state is trying to sell, and we've been in this situation before, what the state is trying to sell is officially not making any money. So by regulation, if we're talking about electricity distribution, electricity distributors are not allowed to make money. So, if somebody can tell me, one good reason why a serious foreign investor will seriously look at something like that, well, the answer wasn't found last time around, which was in the beginning of 2000. I was lucky enough to work with my colleagues with Electricité de France. And at that time, instead of lengthy regulation, a one-off decision was made that guaranteed a return on the purchase price to investors. So, just to conclude that, privatization is good, but in my opinion, is not going to move the needle. It's very important. I think, what we need to prove that, Ukraine is an improving story, to show people that the reforms are not only, only painful and, are the bad word. We need to, do things in a timely manner and bring as much investment, capital investment into the country as possible in a meaningful way, so it restarts the growth. The good thing is that we're starting from a low base, has been discussed before. To get to 6-7% GDP growth that Mr. Danyliuk was talking about, and a number of other experts are talking about, is not that difficult and realistic, and it can be done in a sustainable, structured way. Just put the things or the figures into perspective. The much talked about agriculture. The state is sitting on 12 million hectares of land, state-owned. The average rent that is paid by the private sector on 1 hectare is $150 roughly. So even if you round up, just on the state-owned land that can be sold without, exploding the minds of populists, the state is sitting on 15 billion conservatively if you use a cap rate of 10%. This is without kind of the GDP multiplier and all these wonderful things. The energy sector, the good thing is that the gas prices have been liberalized, market level. Investors want to get in, and if we market this well enough and set, the clear rules or continue to adhere to clear rules on pricing, we're easily talking about, 3 billion that can be and will be put into exploration over, a pretty short period of time, 5 years. And, I can go on and give you, other examples and figures, but just think about it, just think about the figures that I mentioned and, compare it with $100 billion GDP that this country has at the moment, 18 billion roughly, give or take, gross reserves of the national bank, and the incremental borrowing of 1 billion that we just talked about, and total IMF program of 15 billion that in theory can be extended. So those are big numbers that can move the needle. They will move the needle, and then we can be in the territory, if not negative, but then much lower interest rate or cost of capital.
Thank you very much. Coming from the other end of the panel, I do want to just broach the question, which I'm very surprised hasn't come up most of the day, which is a good chunk of the country is mired in a conflict, albeit something of a frozen conflict. What impact do you think this has on investment in Ukraine? Obviously, the situation is very different if you're looking at Lviv compared to looking at the Donbass. There are lots of different economies within Ukraine. No one has sort of mentioned the rather obvious point that has created uncertainty on the ground. I mean, Timothy, is this something that you think weighs strongly in your calculations or not so much?
It's clearly a factor, the relationship with Russia. It would certainly help the investment case if there was some kind of normalization in terms of the relationship with Russia. And obviously, it is a hot conflict. There is a continuing conflict. And as we saw earlier in the year with re-escalation and then blockade, it can be damaging at particular points along the border, and it can have impacts in terms of the real economy. But in the end, I think the level of intensity of the conflict in the east is manageable for the broader Ukrainian macro. And in a way, I think it's no excuse for policymakers in Ukraine now. In fact, I would argue, I mean, if you think about it, the global environment around Ukraine is pretty favorable. Very cheap financing, reflected in the Eurobond issue. For whatever reason, Putin has decided to take something of a step back in terms of the East. Ukraine has this window of opportunity to implement reform and drive ahead to make the country much more durable, because I think inevitably, or my view anyway, is Putin is not finished with Ukraine. There will be further pressure points between the relationship between Russia and Ukraine needs to build up its economic and military defenses. And I think messing around with these structural reforms that are not rocket science, that are obvious, that need to be done, that have been talked about for years, I think there's no excuse for policymakers. Why are you messing around on pension reform, land reform, anti-corruption, business environment? Get it done, move on, because you will be tested in the future.
Gösta, do you share that view, sort of bracing view, but that the conflict, in a sense, is not an excuse for pushing further on reform? Yes, absolutely.
Yes, I completely share that, and I think the moment is now to implement these reforms. And Minister Danyliuk said that we should not judge Ukraine by its history, but it's difficult not to. And I think it's important to prove us wrong now by actually going ahead and implementing what Tim said. These are obvious reforms. They need to be done sooner rather than later. And I have a hard time finding any plausible arguments not to do it.
Anything else? Anyone would like to ask any questions from the floor? I think we'll go to our last 10 minutes, so slightly closing arguments from the panel. But you've either been an extremely well-behaved or quiet or tired audience. Is there anything else anyone would like to ask? Any challenges you'd like to put to us? If not, we can make them work a bit harder. But it's always nice to hear from you. Silence. The most content audience I've ever addressed. Thank goodness. There's someone to find something to object to. Hello.
I felt the responsibility to ask a question.
Thank you very much. Bailed me out.
I did have one question I was thinking about when I heard the discussion about the privatization. And Ukraine went through a couple of privatization before, and it didn't work that well. So again, it goes back to the question how much it is a new Ukraine and how much the privatization when it's done now will be different from privatization in 2000s. So you operate on Ukrainian financial market. So you think that we are already in a situation where privatization can proceed and bring reasonable results, long-term investors, reasonable price, and not what happened 10 or 15 years ago?
Who'd like to go first on that? Makar, do you have a word on that? And then, because we just heard from Timothy, but anyone feel free to jump in. Makar, why? I would have asked exactly the same. Why sitting there? What's the proof that a privatization will go well?
I guess it's a question, how do you define, it goes well. When you speak to a bureaucrat, probably they will say, well, it's all about the price. And, it's never good enough. And it's not, it's never good enough, for a private sector, for a company owner that does an IPO. It always could be better. Where I'm coming from, I think, given that the pricing for privatization would be low in any case, so I mean it's not gonna, as I said, in my opinion at least, move a needle. Then we all should concentrate on bringing proper people, branded investors, if you want to, branded strategic investors, to buy those companies. And I would argue that the price is secondary, if not unimportant at all. But, if we're talking about branded investors, they want to be given a reason why they should at least, start spending time on looking at something. And my argument was that, everybody talks about the state-owned enterprises, but in terms of assets that are of interest or could be of interest to branded strategic investors are not that many. And in my opinion, the core assets that might be of interest are in the energy sector. But, as I said before, if by definition you're not allowed to make any money, why would you buy it? And why would you spend time looking at it?
Well, I'd like to jump in. Yes.
I'd just like to add something, and I'd like to reconnect to the previous panel, where I think there were two very good points that were made. The first one was that the majority of these state-owned enterprises are loss-making, but that can be changed. A problem right now with a lot of these state-owned enterprises is governance, and that can be improved, and it can be improved by putting in place independent supervisory boards that can hold the executive management to account and improve efficiency in these enterprises. The other thing also related to this is a point that Katarina Rashkova made, that privatizing or improving the state-owned enterprise sector and privatizing is also an anti-corruption measure. And I think there are overwhelmingly good reasons to start to address this oversized sector, which is about 20% of GDP, employing more than 1 million people, and start to have a good plan for how to downsize. And I think in key to do this, and I think the question was referring to the bad experience of the 1990s and the privatizations at that time. And I think the solution to that is to have an open, transparent, and market-based process for the privatizations. And by having that, I think a lot of these concerns can be addressed.
Neil, convinced?
Yes and no. I mean, in terms of the price, as I don't know this country, this is my first visit, but I understand the amount of equity you have, not priced, but in terms of land and property, it's undervalued. There's a huge richness to this country. So I would just come back to my point earlier, which is if you go too fast and you don't have sufficient governance, that if you don't take the people with you, you're going to misprice it. You're going to have lots of winners and lots of losers, and you're going to have all the problems that Jonathan Ostry talked about earlier, which is you're going to raise inequality, you're not going to have sustainable growth. So I would say get the reforms right first, and take the people with you.
Bingo, job done. Makar, I think the last word from you. You take the people with you, get the job done. Sounds great. What gets in the way? Last thought from you, please.
Can you repeat the question?
Well, get the job done, take the people with you. Sounds like a very good recipe. What gets in the way?
Well, I think, nothing gets in the way. In terms of, transparency, I think most of the critical privatization auctions are done with participation or managed by international investment banks or consultants. Even on the panel, we're having this debate, now, tomorrow, pricing, so on and so forth. Going back to the comment about corporate governance, if you think about it in practical terms, it will take you 2-3 years to put proper corporate governance and turn, some of these companies around. But my argument is more fundamental. Those businesses are primarily loss-making because, there is something wrong with the business model. You think, they cannot sell OPP, Odessa Biport Plan, for a strange reason. Well, it's not a strange reason. There is only one asset which is of interest, or a part of this asset which is of interest to serious people. The rest is not, because with current gas prices, the whole business doesn't make any sense. And it's unfortunately something that Ukraine has to admit. It has its own place on the globe. And there is no Ukrainian globe, so it has, on the global globe. And, just admit it, some things make sense, and, in some sectors Ukraine has competitive advantages, in others it doesn't. And, just live with that and develop, sectors where you have global competitiveness and cut the losses on where you are nowhere. So, just to make it clear, I think that, everything that we talked about made a lot of sense. But, to move the needle, to kind of open the gates for the flood of investment, we need to be credible. And, or Ukraine needs to be credible. And, privatization is one of the, first steps in that direction. But what I've been trying to say, probably not very, clearly, is that to make success and to bring foreign direct investments in a meaningful manner, the state, unfortunately, has to play a very important role through changing the existing regulations, by adopting the land reform. It's, one of the key things that, if we're talking about sizable investments. Because if we're not doing all these reforms, then, the size is not going to come. And, I would like to conclude by one thing. We've been talking about, reforms, no reforms, access to private market. I would argue that Ukraine has no choice but to do the reforms. Because logically, if you think about it, IMF is now, the main funder, the main driver of the reforms and funding. Yeah, $1 billion here, $1 billion there in terms of, international borrowing doesn't count. To be able to have a stronger negotiation position with IMF, you need access in a meaningful way to private capital. And you cannot get that without doing meaningful reforms. And this is what Timothy Ash said. Yeah, we can be overweight, but we can be overweight, and others on the equity side will, or FDI side will be saying exactly the same, if we believe you. So you get your act together, you do the reforms, then we have an alternative to IMF, and then we could be having philosophical discussions about what should be done first, what should be done second. Now we are where we are. IMF is the only lender, and we have to do what they say and work on the alternatives. Then, in true competition, the true pricing comes out, and I think we as citizens will benefit from that.
Timothy, you get a haiku last comment. I was interested in your view that you were thinking about, I love the use of overweight, by the way. Is this the only place where the word overweight, just doesn't mean something really terrible? I got worried about after eating that good Ukrainian food and wine last night. Have you been a bit reassured or galvanized by what you heard today, or do you go away still with your worry hat on about Ukraine?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, I hear the same thing every conference I come to in Ukraine. It's the same story. It's always corruption, business environments, lots of plans. I mean, put it this way. I mean, foreign direct investors that Ukraine really wants, right? I mean, in the end, they've got a short attention span. They're covering 100 countries, right? They read the FT. You need to change the narrative, right?
You read the Economist as well. When they want to go a bit deeper.
The Economist, they need to change the narrative. When they open the FT, they don't want to be reading about NAFTA gas. They want to be reading about positive things about Ukraine. Unfortunately, everything they read in the FT and the Economist is corruption, problems, all this kind of stuff. So you need to create some good news stories. I mean, you know, Saakashvili has been, obviously the Saakashvili-Poroshenko thing didn't kind of go down very well. But I mean, what Saakashvili did in Georgia was create a positive narrative for foreign direct investors. You know, this business environment thing, you know, whenever you opened anything up about Georgia, it was positive. That's what you need to do. On privatization, just to conclude, basically, I mean, unfortunately, there isn't much left of value. Let's be honest about it. Ukraine's elites have ripped the face off the population already, right? Not much left of value to sell. So it is all about improving corporate governance and all that kind of stuff. But actually, going back to land reform, I mean, you've got, what, 10 million hectares of land in state ownership? 10 million hectares of land. Sell it. $1,000, 1,000 euros a hectare, 10 billion euros. Buy back debt, you reduce your borrowing cost by 200 basis points. Imagine the FT or an Economist coverage of that, I should say. Really, really positive. Or create an innovation fund or an education fund. I mean, use the money for something positive, but you need to change the narrative around Ukraine and really address this corruption issue, which is killing the country.
Well, look, thank you very much. That was kind of quite strongly worded, but I think deeply felt. And many friends of Ukraine probably share some sympathy. I should say, by the way, that The Economist, though it did write a piece about it over a year and a half ago, bemoaning the misery of the economic situation in Ukraine, has more recent coverage, but as he said, not only a place to be miserable about. So the narrative is pretty mixed, and there are some sort of bright spots in the darkness, but there do need to be more. And I think we've heard some very interesting solutions and proposals today. I have to leave you now. Our panel have worked very hard. We did finally get the magic of Skype to work. Thank you all very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference.